Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Bruce Lewin. Is it Lewin?
It is.
Lewin. Well, it could be Leuven, if in certain languages. So it's Lewin,
Sure.
and he's in Pretoria, South Africa. So welcome, Bruce, and give us an idea of who you are and what stuff you're interested in, and you know whatever you want to say. It's your platform
Sure.
now.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for the invitation. So, so I'm Bruce Lewin. I'm the founder of the Love, Trust and Wealth Network. And this is basically a network that's um, ultimately kind of designed to help people generate more love, trust, and wealth for themselves. And ideally to do that twice as fast as the other means they could do it in, all the other sort of alternative ways you might do this. And I guess to clarify, by love, we're talking about platonic love, not romantic love. So so there's a more
Yeah,
of a professional
yeah.
and a business focus than a personal one. But obviously people love they love their work, they love the people they work. Hopefully they love their work, they love the people they work with, they love what they're doing and so on and so forth. Um, but in essence, that's kind of a little bit about the network. But specifically what we've done is we found a way to bottle trust or to help people to create trust very, very quickly in small groups. And this is business level trust. So the type of scenarios where you feel comfortable enough to share what you're working on, to obviously share problems that are relevant to your kind of goals and activities. And then having done that, you typically start to help each other solve problems, work towards objectives. And because you're building that trust in that community, that's kind of a natural progression into problems, then into solutions and help and achieving goals. Um, and we kind of do that through two sort of elements, really. The first is a menu of relationships. So this is basically a predictive model where there are 14 relationships and the top four make for an ideal network. So in essence, it acts as a quality filter. So everyone you're going to meet in the network, you're going to share one of these top four relationships with. And then additionally, if you share the menu and have trusted contacts or your friends also join, we'll also tell you which of the 14 relationships you share with them, because typically there's a lot of more resonance when you're kind of looking at people you've known for a number of years, and then it kind of gives you a lot of explanations and dynamics and metaphors and so forth. And then obviously predictably with new people, that's where, as I say, the predictive piece comes in. But in essence, this menu acts as a quality control or a filter. These are the people that are on your wavelength that are going to get you, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously the other 10 relationships ultimately don't make for an ideal network is the very short version. And then the second thing we do is we create what we call tables for six. So if you imagine a group of people, four, five, six people, meet weekly, broadly speaking, a peer, common interests, overlapping experience and so forth. Obviously share the menu and a common or complementary geography. When you meet weekly as a small group of, five or six, that's the kind of basically lived experience or the process by which all of these outcomes happen. And as I said at the start, community, trust, solving problems, looking at achieving goals and working towards those goals, sharing introductions, collaborating. One might become the client of the other, or someone might help you find a client. It's that sort of stuff that typically falls out of in terms of the benefits and the value and what would be useful about this for people. So in brief, that's what it's about.
I love it. It's brilliant and it's needed.
Thank you.
And I have all these questions. Um, I'm glad you've defined love as platonic. I'm curious about
Sure.
what trust actually is. I'm curious about how you define wealth, and we'll get to all these things. And then your network is actually a network of relationships, not simply. a network of connections, as I assume.
Yeah.
So, so my first question is this one: the people that join this network,
Mhm.
who are they? What is there a type of, is there an archetype that joins? And let me be more specific in what I'm saying. There are people, and many of these people have been on the podcast. There are people I know who have sort of a level of freedom in their work, in their employment, where they really can broaden their network all the time, and our mutual friend John Granholm is one of those people, and he's expanding his network all the time, and I'm privileged to be part of his network as you are.
Right.
My curiosity is, what about people who say own a business where they got more than say 20 or 30 people that work for them, and because what you're talking about is really something for people who have large or small, medium-sized businesses, that they need this kind of thing maybe more than those of us who are kind of solopreneurs or small business people, because small business people are looking for relationships all the time, because
Mhm.
we need help. We recognize we need help because we're small potatoes in a big sack. And so I'm curious about how this this idea, this practice, this methodology translates into places where you have people who are kind of looked at as these are the leaders of our business. We all defer to that person. We're responsible to that person. We're accountable to that person. How do you have people who factor into that level of um, of business that funds their way into your network?
So you're asking, do you have people who are managing teams and running their own business with X number of employees,
Yeah,
basically? So yeah, I mean, we have people ultimately. So I guess this is a slightly longer answer to your question, but
it's
the short
good.
answer is
You can
yes.
be as long as you want.
And the slightly longer answer is what we found is the sweet spot seems to be amongst two or three constituent groups. So
Uh-huh.
to your point about business owners and entrepreneurs, if as you're describing, that person has a successful ongoing business where their number one priority is not purely focused on top line revenue, where they've got a pipeline, they've got people delivering, they've got a team around them, et cetera, and they want something over and above a purely sales driven outcome. So that might be community driven, that could be more nuanced goals of the business, it could be seeking help, et cetera, et cetera. That's a great audience. Entrepreneurs, business owners in that space,
Yeah.
that's a great audience. They want to learn, they want to give back, so on and so on and so on. As I say, it doesn't really work for people who just want sales because we don't really do that, and it's very it wouldn't be right to set people's expectations as that's what we're going to do. So that's not really a relevant audience in essence. And I think then the other audience is basically your mid and senior career people, where again they obviously have a whole host of professional objectives as you'd appreciate, but what's unique for them. So going back to the entrepreneurs, the business owners, they typically want to meet peers, solve problems, get into the nuanced issues that they're faced with, with that balance between community and commercial outcomes. In essence, so business is kind of the underlying driver for those people. With your mid and senior career people, obviously their professional objectives are equally important. But what we found, particularly last year, is, and to a lesser extent historically, is people in that career space, in those corporate roles or working for companies of any kind of size, you typically find that you can't, there's only so many problems you can share with your boss or your bosses for
Right,
obvious
right,
reasons.
right.
And there's only so many problems you can share with people who report to you or who are more junior. So you're kind of a little bit trapped in what you can say to whom. And with your peers, you're obviously going to be again quite selective because you don't want to appear to be the sort of, the weak fish in the pool, as it were, or, the weak fish in the pond. So again, you are a little bit constrained as to what you can say to your colleagues in all the different places in the hierarchy. And then you have a similar problem, which is that in the vast majority of cases, going home to a spouse or a partner at the end of the day, there's only so much you can share and have a meaningful conversation. Your spouse might be the best listener in the world and so on, but they probably may not, they won't, they probably don't know the industry, they probably don't know the job, and they probably don't know the people anywhere near as well as you on all three levels. There's only so much they can contribute positively or actually contribute proactively over and above being a very good listener to you. And so again, that's a very nice sweet spot. And I think then the bigger picture in all of this amongst these sort of two groups is people, I think, have an intrinsic sense, and it's part of the human condition, that we do more together and we're intrinsically collaborative and intrinsically relational.
Yeah.
That's why there are so many networks around the world, digital and real world. Just so, and that's why Threads, however many years ago now, 2, 3, 4 years ago, went from zero to like, I don't know, a billion users in like 10 seconds, right? Because everyone wants to collaborate, everyone wants to communicate with whatever your agenda, whatever your interests. I think that's a fundamental part of human nature.
Yeah.
We are fundamentally relational. I mean, that's why we're top of the food chain as well, right? Because we collaborate and coordinate in a way that very few, really no other species does ultimately.
Um, I mean, this fits into so many things that I do. Um, for one, I'm curious about your network of relationships. What does that look like? And when I'm saying that, I'm asking what is the makeup of your network, your personal network,
Mhm.
in terms of cultural and country of origin diversity. How
Okay.
far does you or do you reach into the world with your network? Because I'm taking notes here. What I'm seeing
Okay.
here is what I have been talking about for about 25 years, which is that um, the digital world allows us to be members of everyone's local community. So you're there in
Hmm.
Pretoria, and if you and I are having a conversation, and you can be talking about something that's say going on with the schools in Pretoria, and and I could become involved in just talking with you about that, and all of a sudden I'm able to have a contribution to the betterment of the schools in Pretoria. See, I think that's the that's the unacknowledged uh, transformative effect of digital technology is that it does break down all those barriers that once were huge inhibitors to people doing really good work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, you want me to tell you then where people are based and the geography and all
Yeah,
that stuff?
yeah. I'm curious as to how, what's your reach? Because if
So,
your reach will have a necessary impact around the world, and what I'm really saying is I want to celebrate that, and I want people to hear that what you have created is not just, oh, this is just Bruce's little project here. No, this is something
sure.
that has a reach that has a real potential for making a difference that matters.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. And I think so. So, if you want a whistle stop tour of the members,
Yeah, let's
it
have
is
that.
very it is global. It is basically in the English speaking world with one or two exceptions. But basically, so kind of starting on the Pacific coast, British Columbia, California, lots of people in North America, in all four of the continental time zones, Mountain, Central, Eastern. Um, there's a guy down in Ecuador, an American guy down in Ecuador. But basically, then when you get to Europe, so I'm South, there's a few South Africans. I'm obviously in South Africa, although I'm a Brit. UK, France, Netherlands, um, and Portugal at the moment. And then as you kind of go further east, it's going to be places like Singapore, New Zealand, trying to think. Oh, and then India as well. India as
Yeah.
well. Fairly spread. Well, very spread ultimately, because you probably wouldn't, the sun might not set on that one.
Well, my network is very similar, and I have a list here somewhere of all the countries from where guests have come from, and I think there are like 40 countries that I may be wrong on that, but 41, I think, maybe it. And I mean, you're the second person in the last 10 days I've interviewed in South Africa.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. How about
Very
that?
cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that because when what I find, and sorry I keep talking but I'm
No,
really
no, no.
excited about what you're doing. What I have found is that, and I bet you have found this to be true too, that there is far more that we share in common than we find that are different from one another
Absolutely.
worldwide.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And
So
I think, I mean, but
yeah.
yeah, the short answer.
So so trust comes so let's talk about how what trust actually is. How does that get manifested in a network where people are just digitally connected to one another, unless they actually happen to live in the same city and then they can get together. But what I find is that most people only know each other through a screen. And
Yeah.
so, what does trust look like there?
I think, I mean, I haven't looked into the nitty-gritty of the academic research on trust. There probably will be academics who've got measures and you kind of tick the boxes and answer questions and you kind of quantify in inverted commas academically. But I think on a more practical, everyday sense,
Yeah.
the first thing is that you can't buy trust. You
Hmm.
can't obviously buy love and wealth either in conventional senses of the word.
Hmm.
And equally, we all have that sense of I now trust this person. Trust can obviously be broken, and it's like a vase. Once it's broken, you can try and repair it, but that vase will always have the cracks in, right? You'll always, if you kind of know it's been cracked, and you'll know it's been cracked. So rebuilding it is always an imperfect process, basically. But I think it's a fundamentally human thing. It's like you build that trust. When you've known someone for 2 hours versus 20 hours versus 2 years, all of those things build trust. And I guess there's an element of context in that, you know, typically in a business setting, certainly in the same company, you want very high levels of trust. You want very high levels of trust with professional advisors and kind of those problems are certainly the one with professional advisors, broadly speaking, solved. It's not perfect, but there's all the credentials and regulations and whatever. But I think it's a very human experience. You get that sense. I said X, they said Y. And we had an hour's conversation and we agreed on this and we agreed on that. And then we said we took again and it builds organically. And I think the point is that the challenge that I think people face today, given the proliferation of all the kind of smartphone stuff and the internet and so on, is partly the opportunity cost of investing that time to build that trust with whoever it may be is it feels very much higher than it might have been historically. And I think the other challenge is when you look at it through the lens of networking, because you've got that high opportunity cost, people, I think, often feel like, well, I'm just going to keep casting my line and trying to catch basically a great connection and the trust will come because I've done that myself and I'm an adult and so on and so on. But it's ultimately very organic. And I just think that because this menu serves as the catalyst to create that trust with the proviso that you agree to talk to these people on a regular basis, on a weekly basis. And that's kind of what it comes down to. And you yourself know, oh, I feel comfortable with these people or this person. I'm going to share more about myself and share more about what's important to me. This other person doesn't understand the thing I'm saying. I'm just not going to waste my time. So I don't feel I can trust them. So I'm not going to waste any more time or energy with them. And I just think it's a human component, but the menu serves as there's a great deal of overlap between those four. relationships and the propensity to feel that community and trust. That's what it kind of comes down to.
Yeah, I totally agree. And from my perspective, what I see is that in order for trust to be manifested, you first must have respect, mutual respect, and
Hmm.
and that's an acceptance of the other as somewhat of value or however you want to call it. Um, but so
Yeah.
okay, so I get the trust thing, and I totally agree with you. I'm totally aligned with that. What I'm curious about. See, one of the things that I operate with is the notion that leadership is not a role or a title. It's a way we function as human beings, and that all
Hmm.
leadership begins with personal initiative.
Hmm.
So I'm curious as to how that
Hmm.
personal initiative gets expressed in your network. And in particular, I'm wondering to what extent are people that are already embedded in your network introducing people on the outside of the network to your network? Is that happening a lot?
That is starting to happen because, I mean, again, to cut a long story short, one of the things we've kind of realized is um, when you invite other people to join and you can, who you already know, and you can see where this menu works between the two of you. So in other words, which one of these 14 relationships you share, that's typically of material value to both parties. And so we are just sowing the seeds of that process. Obviously, we've had plenty of people invite their friends and that sort of thing as well. But I think we're kind of um, making a point of sort of sharing that observation with people as early as possible, because whatever you choose to do in the network and how you kind of experience the whole affair, that is where you're going to get the quickest amount of value in the context of this network for yourself. So in other words, how does this menu relate to me and the people I work with most closely, or me and my advisors, or me and my trusted contacts? And so that becomes a great excuse and a great kind of basis to to kind of explore all of that basically.
How long have you been doing this?
So I mean there's a bit of an interesting timeline, but the very short version is last year, and to a lesser extent 2024, but certainly last year was a huge amount of trial error and testing and building and IT stuff and things like that, positioning and marketing, to the point now where I think so we've now run 7 tables. That's not obviously a huge number, but enough that it all of those 7 tables have had varying degrees of success. And if they have disbanded, they typically disbanded because of change in circumstances. Like I've moved, and the time zones don't work, or the times don't work. I've got a new job, that type of thing.
So
But
it's
otherwise,
so is it
go on.
um so each of the tables is what, 6 people? Is that what is that what I
Yeah,
heard before? And
yeah,
so
4, 5, 6 people exactly. Yeah,
and and they meet weekly, did you say?
yeah, weekly. Yeah.
And I'm just wanting our audience to grasp hold of the shape of this thing because um, there are a lot of conversation groups out there, and
Hmm.
some of them are really good, and some of them are quite wonderfully average. Average is okay, but they're average. They're not going anywhere, but they are providing something that the persons involved are searching for. It's a connection, maybe not at the depth that what you're talking about. Um, so to what extent is this a response to COVID? Is because I see a lot of these kinds of groups forming because COVID was such a difficult time for so many people that they needed more human interaction, and that's where a lot of these groups kind of got their initiation.
I think there's no question that COVID impacted everyone who lived through it, right? It was a crazy time, and let's all part that one there. But as a catalyst, as we all know, it's had a huge implications for everyone, or lots and lots of people,
Right.
Not everyone, obviously. And I think for me, what happened was um, the real kind of founding or kind of germination of the idea was this was the summer of 23, June, July time, and I was visiting a client and a friend in Virginia. And we went to, and so this was my third time to the States, and I wasn't in Manhattan, right? Which I was quite pleased about. And because I was with a friend and he lives there, you get all that. But if you travel as a tourist, it's one thing. If you travel with a local, it's a whole different ballgame.
That's
And he was
right.
like, "We're going to do X, we're going to do Y. Here's all the things we do." So that all that was fantastic, right? We went to this festival, and it was interesting because I kind of partly had expectations of something a little bit more lively, but then it was a Sunday afternoon, in the summer, in a kind of, sort of meadows and forests and green spaces and so on. Anyway, what struck me very acutely was this sense of sort of disconnection
Hmm.
that you could just kind of, I just could just pick it up just partly through all sorts of different reasons. And it was kind of like, okay, this is quite a surprise. I would not have, if there was ever a place where you thought you'd feel a sense of connection and community and I guess camaraderie, would be at a summertime festival on a Sunday afternoon in a lovely, obviously in a lovely part of the state. And yeah, there were families there, young kids, and I think sort of all generations were happily represented. But there was this strange disconnection that I just kind of hadn't really felt before. Or if I had felt it, I couldn't really remember. And I'm quite lucky because, as you can appreciate, if you go to a foreign land and you speak the same language but don't have the accent, it does kind of give away the fact that you don't live there. And so it was quite easy and quite fun to talk to everyone and to be quite frank and be far more direct than I would have been in the UK. Which was good. So I really kind of got a sense of where everyone was coming from. And it just kind of struck me that, because there's many relationships we've worked with it sort of for about 20 years in the corporate space. So we've done a lot of work, with teams and leaders and all the rest of it. And it just sort of struck me, and the guy who'd taken me along also had done it, we'd done a lot of work together as well. So I just sort of said to him, look, I've got this sense that we can create this now. He was also talking about leaving his corporate role. And as you know, when you sort of step outside of one role and you're looking for a second role, you often rely heavily on your network and it becomes a key catalyst in what the next role might be and who opens the doors and all the rest of it. So it was partly having his story in my head and partly this festival and partly, just the fact that this menu can be applied in a networking sense as opposed to a purely corporate sense or a business sense. That was really the catalyst. And I think things kind of developed from there in terms of the time frames. But I was very much of, so I was like, okay, this could work in principle. But my first instinct from that point onwards was, are there any fundamental barriers or big obstacles you need to overcome? Like, do you need to raise X, Y, and Z amount of money? Are there sort of other problems? You do your kind of research on the scenario. Like, what do we need to make this happen? Okay, there's no obvious sort of deal breakers or things that need to be overcome or sort of obvious problems on that might apply on the journey. 2024 was very, very experimental with basically two tables, one that I was a member of and one that I wasn't a member of, and they both went very well. And then 2025 was when things really kind of, I guess I started to work on it full time well, the back end of 24, but into 25. And so that then was kind of how things grew, and you test and you refine, you go feedback, and you sort of try and balance everything. Like, what can you do? What does everyone want? And you kind of try and bring the two together, basically.
It sounds to me like you have taken a mechanism, part of the term mechanism, but you've got a mechanism there for doing something more than just
Mhm.
bringing people together for love, trust, and wealth. You really are also analyzing the nature of humanity in the at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. And I'm being
Now you're getting deep, man.
well, I think what you said is really quite deep. I mean, the fact that you walk into
Hmm.
this festival in Virginia and you find that that at a festival where people are supposed to be having this this lively experience of
Yeah.
being together, you walked away feeling disconnection, and that doesn't surprise me. And
Hmm.
what I'm saying is, I think that you're onto something that is more significant simply than the purpose of what you're doing. And it may not be that's your mission, but it
Hmm.
may be one of the effects of what you're doing is that this provides a way for other people, on the outside who are looking in, to identify things that you're seeing that make sense, that you're kind of validating
Hmm.
um, impressions that we have about the world, and what you're providing is just one more kind of validation point for saying, okay, yeah, there really is. Um, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with Hartmut Rosa, who's a German sociologist, but he's written a lot about this stuff. The acceleration of the pace of society, but he also writes about alienation as this experience that people have. And I think a lot of these groups are a direct response to the sense of alienation they feel. And and I don't think it's simply COVID at all. I think it's actually baked into how our societies globally have been organized. And
Yeah.
so my little frame for this, I call it the two global forces. And I
Mm.
see that there's a global force of centralized institutions of governance and finance. And then I see there is a global force of decentralized networks of relationships. And you,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
are you are a creator of that, in that second force. And what I've identified, I identified this 25 years ago, was what was happening was the centralized force was declining and the decentralized force was ascending. And they've crossed at some point that is undeterminable. But the networks that you're creating, is ascending, and what you're learning from this is really valuable. And that's really part of what I want to say is what you're learning um, becomes sort of the generational history of your generation, our generation, that we're going to pass on to the future generation. Say, this is how we should be as people living in a globally connected world.
Yeah. Because I think to your point, and it's a very interesting way. I've never really thought about centralized versus decentralized in the way you're describing it. And I like that. And what I've kind of been struck by is I think, you know, people at one point, for centuries will have lived in small villages. For the vast majority of people live rurally, effectively is the way you would define it, rurally versus in an urban environment.
Right.
And in a rural environment, and remember, you know, cars and trains only really got going as a sort of mass modes of transportation in the early 20th century, in the late 19th century,
Right.
right? I mean, Henry Ford and Mercedes and blah, 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 and the trains and whatever. So obviously prior to that, you're either on foot or you're on a horse. And even if you're on a horse, it's still a long way to go. It still takes a long time to cover 100 miles or 500 miles or whatever it might be. And what that means is, by definition, your physical mobility is seriously restricted. And we obviously, if you want to get into an evolutionary perspective, a biological perspective, just walking, it's a hell of a journey to walk 100 miles.
Yeah.
And then you want to come back again. That's a similarly intense journey, right? It's a full on. You don't bat an eye if you're going to drive it in a car. Oh, great, yeah, whatever. Get the music on, no big deal. Whatever. This is what I need to do. But I think because of that being a big part of human history over the centuries and ultimately over the millennia. I mean, obviously you had people in boats as well with wind and rowing and all the rest of it and oars. but you've obviously got to be on the water for that to work, or at least on a big lake or a river or something. So when you're on the land, you can only walk or take a horse or camel or whatever. And so people for centuries have been used to living in these very small, very predictable groups.
Hmm.
And that was how humanity survived for millennia around the world. Come the 20th century and the ginormous waves of urbanization, which obviously happened economically and move into the city and get a job and make more money and blah 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 blah. But you don't have to work on the land anymore. You go in a factory, a better quality of life. And so obviously the vast majority of people in basically all countries in the world have done that, or a great number of countries have urbanized as they have. And now you're left with situations where in towns or cities, you're now bumping into many, many, many more people that
Hmm.
you wouldn't have done that in the past. You would have just basically been dealt. So in a church, in a family, in a town context, in a village context, you'd had a group of people, and that group would have been fairly consistent with births and deaths over the decades. In a city and in a big town of say even 10,000 people, but certainly 50,000, 100,000 and bigger, it's all over the place, and so it's quite a jump. And so you don't have that chance as easily as you had in a rural setting to build those long-lasting relationships.
Hmm.
Because people do move around and they do travel and they do get jobs and they do go away and study and they go back to home because they want to take care of family members and so on and so on and so on. But that fluidity in terms of people's social mobility is ginormous. And it's one of many, many factors along which you have, COVID and digitization and the transactional nature of kind of people in the workplace and in, the employee-employee contract, the social contract in a country. And there's a great long list of factors that have started they've either broken or they're creaking under a huge amount of pressure, given it's 2026 and not sort of 1986 or 1966, for argument's sake. And people are at a bit of a loss. And you can see it with loneliness, you can see it with mental health, you can see it with mental health drug prescriptions. You can see it with these rise of people wanting to talk to each other. I think it's fundamental to who we are as people, to who we are as the human race. And the last story I'll tell you, kind of while I'm sort of on a bit of a roll, basically, but there's a US academic called William Hipple, Bill Hipple, and I think he either did this research or he was talking about this research, that it was done in Kenya. And it's basically like, okay, let's go and meet some tribesmen who are nomadic hunters and gatherers. They have a nomadic, like a bit like the Bushmen in Botswana, if you kind of
The
ever
Maasai,
familiar with that
the
part of the world.
Maasai.
And basically the research was exactly the Maasai in Kenya and I think it's the Khoi in Botswana, Khoi San people in Botswana. But
Hmm.
anyway,
Yeah.
in Kenya, Maasai, he said, look, okay, so the basic story is this: we're in the village, and let's just say, for the sake of the conversation, there's 10 of us who go hunting, right? When you ask everyone how do they pick who they want to go hunting with, and typically you might have two, three, four people go hunting out of a group of 10 people who are available. The kind of Western and certainly the kind of economic and sort of capitalist philosophy is I'm going to pick the 10, out of the 10 people, I'm going to pick the best hunters. Because you want to have the best accountants, the best people, the best talent, blah, 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 blah. Right? What he finds in this pre-agricultural revolution environment, in this kind of nomadic lifestyle, is all the people that go hunting have an opinion on what's a minimum level of competence to make a good hunter. And so from there, you might say, right, well, I personally think 8 of us are good enough. There's 2 of them that I just don't think they can do the job. You might say, well, there's only 7 of us that can do the job. But we will all have our personal minimum requirements that mean these people I think are up to the job. The other guys just don't cut it. Okay, fine, whatever. Once you've then determined who has the minimum level of competence as per your own definition, everyone then picks the people whose company they enjoy the most to go hunting. They
Yeah.
don't go, oh, this person's the best, they're the second best. It's like, no, I want to go hunting with Ed and John because they're great. I don't want to go with Adam and Bob because, they're a bit boring. Right? And I think that let's assume this research is true. I'm pretty sure it will be. Um, it flies in the face of kind of Western, conventional Western economics, conventional Western business thought that you have to have the best. Actually, what you'd rather have is subject to a minimum level of competence, which is obviously important. You don't want someone who can't do the job, obviously. But thereafter, once they can do the job, you want people whose company you enjoy and who actually make the whole experience pleasurable and interesting and something you'd want to do again, not well, as opposed to just it not being that. And I think that isn't really in the business world in a I don't think that idea,
Oh,
I've never come across that idea before in a kind of business context, at least.
I see. And I agree with you. And my experience with people in Africa, particularly in Kenya, is exactly the way you described it. And um, what I see is that we have our awareness of time is very short. And so we think of what we
Hmm.
experience as kind of default. When if we had the experience
Yeah,
of 1,000 years, we would see that the kind of world that we have created, the modern world with um, its various mechanism for employing people to do manual labor, which they have no final, um, they're not craftspersons, they're just assembly or people. And and that
yeah, yeah,
and that in order to satisfy their need for some kind of um, sense of meaning, they um, created the whole notion that we are foremost consumers, and that we
yeah.
find meaning by the things that we buy, the things that we purchase. And what I think, if we look at the whole history of humankind over over many millennia, you'll see that's an unsustainable model.
Of course, of
And
course. And I would go on.
well, and what I'm coming back to what you're doing, which is is it an antidote? Is it a therapeutic solution? I don't know what or whatever we want to call it, but it is pushing back against that to say who we are in our relationship with one another matters more than my status or the kind of car I drive or the clothes I wear or whatever it may be or the job I have. Um, my my sense is the people who have the least have a kind of a wisdom that those of us who have the most can never acquire because we're too busy taking care of all this stuff we purchased. And
Right, right. No, it's very true. It's very true. Um, I think I think
so
the other thing, go on.
the reason why I'm putting it in this frame is I want to hear what you have to say about wealth because that's a part of
Okay,
your network because that's the other piece that we haven't hadn't
good question. Right, good question. So obviously, as I said before, you can't buy wealth in the traditional sense. You have to generate wealth. You might inherit. I mean, firstly, most people think of wealth in terms of financial assets and numbers that they can write down in a spreadsheet on a piece of paper. That is obviously one measure of wealth, and that particular measure can't be bought. And basically, apart from bank deposit scheme or the insurance of bank deposits, no one gives you a guarantee on any wealth that you might have. No one says a house or an asset or whatever is going to guarantee through X, Y, Z. I mean, leaving aside sort of, more exotic financial transactions where those guarantees exist. In simple terms, no one gives you a guarantee on wealth, it is the essence. And so people think about it, understand it in financial terms, and that's to be expected. I think the other two elements of wealth, one is health and one is time. Okay. So
Mm.
again, you can't buy either of these things. You can go and buy advice and surgery and drugs. You can't buy the actual outcome you're looking for in a conventional sense. So if you have if you find your health is not where you want it to be, you can't just pay some money and 24 hours later it's all back to normal. Health doesn't work like that. And it is a good substitute for wealth because as many people have said, you can't buy health and all the assets you have and nothing without your health to enjoy them and so on and so on and so on. So that's the health component. And then the other component is time. So again, you cannot buy time, no matter who you are, no matter how much money you have, as much or as little, you can't buy time. And that's the other factor. So again, going back to what we've been talking about, there's a traditional sense of like, the working year, the working week, the amount of holiday you get in the year, public holidays, all the rest of it. And you could debate about maternity leave and all the kind of ways in which leave is granted to people through a typical year. But unless you go out and you say, I'm going to be basically completely solopreneur, completely my own boss, even then it's quite rare to earn enough money and to keep your commercial relationships going that you can do 6 months on and 6 months off on your own, right? I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's fairly
Very
rare.
difficult. Yeah.
And yeah, people do. I'm going to take a year off. I'm going to traveling, but the idea of saying, oh well, I kind of have this, I have this sort of big chunks of free time, big chunks of work time, unless you're in a kind of shift-based industry or you work on oil rigs or something like that, very seasonal work. People just expect you to be around, 250 odd days of the year, minus the weekends and minus the public holidays, very, bit of vacation or whatever. And I think that's the part with time is that everyone is in that kind of um, those constraints and those expectations. So even if you were paid enough that you did work half the year, then stop for the other half of the year, which is again, there aren't too many jobs where that's possible. But even if it was possible, everyone would look at you like you were mad, and you'd be like become a pariah in the industry. Like, oh my God, you're doing 6 months of what? Nothing. You're going to do, people don't, people are so kind of fixated on this working life that everybody has as soon as you obviously enter the workforce, that time, as I say, time is a huge luxury. And that's if you're of working age, that's typically how it manifests itself. Those are the boundaries and rules and expectations everyone has. And if you want to opt out of that, it typically comes with it, other than like, I'm going to retire, it typically brings with it lots of other questions and kind of challenges. And so being in a position to choose how you spend your time is an amazing position to be in, but you have to be conscious of the fact that there's all sorts of boundaries and expectations around how you're supposed to spend your time as a, professional person or member of the workforce or whatever.
As someone who is technically retired, you wouldn't know it by my work pattern.
Right.
I'm semi-retired only in the sense that I'm receiving my pension and my Social Security, so I'm getting paid, but it's not enough to sustain me. Um,
Right.
but what I noticed was that um, I noticed exactly what you were saying, exactly, almost to the letter, that for between during my 40s and 50s and and in and somewhat into my 60s, but not very much. But during those 2 decades, I felt a tremendous amount of constraint to not do anything that was personally um, what's the word I'm looking for? That I would be doing things just for my own personal enjoyment. Because I had a
Hmm.
family, I had a business. I was a sole provider, and if I went off and did something crazy, I had to have a way of explaining why I'm doing this. So
Hmm.
22 years ago, back in the early part of this century, I became very interested in the Lewis and Clark expedition. You know that story? Do you know? And
I've heard the name.
well, it was an expedition that that Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, put together in 1803 to send a military unit out past St. Louis, let's just say St. Louis, into areas that no Europeans had ever been in. And they went to map it out and to see what was there and discover trade routes to the Pacific. That was what they were doing.
Hmm.
But what was, to me, what was interesting from a leadership standpoint was how Lewis and Clark led that unit of about 35 people. And they were gone for, the whole thing took about 3 years. And they returned having lost only one person, and they lost him to
Wow.
an appendectomy.
Wow.
So I did a 15-day um, trip out west in Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon,
Hmm.
traveling the trail that they traveled. And, because I had this notion I was going to write a book about it, and I still am. I just hadn't gotten to it yet because it was in the
Hmm.
middle of the bicentennial. I'm over telling the story, but the whole thing was that I knew that I had to explain that I'm going to write a book about this as my rationale for being able to go spend this time doing that.
Hmm.
I don't have to do that now that I'm in my 70s. I can just do whatever I
Hmm.
want. And so I spent about 6 years in Wyoming, living in Wyoming, and I spent parts of 2 months last year out there. So I just, and then if someone said, "Well, if you could be given anything in the world, what would you want?" I said, "I'd like to have a free corporate jet to fly around the world to see my friends."
Right.
So
Right.
I think there's an age component for all this, is what I'm
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel that my time, I mean, I'm planning to live past 100, that the time I have is really what my wealth is. And I guard my time
Hmm.
and I could do better on my health, but um but I'm not unhealthy. It's just that
Hmm.
I think what you're talking about is really true, and I think other people need to kind of grasp hold of this. Because I find that they feel very beholden to other notions that have no real benefit for them, but they feel like they must kind of comply with it. Um,
Mm.
and which I think comes back to saying, well, you really have to know who you are and know what your values are in order to be able to say, well, I'm going to trust this person because we share some of the same values, for example, or I'm going to love something. I'm going to give myself something because it enhances the things that I value.
Hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, I mean, my sort of take as well is that most people see, if you ask most people what their big highlights are and the things they enjoy the most and their big achievements and best days in their life and all this type of thing, I suspect the vast majority of the things that they talk about will have either would have happened in person, or there would have been a very strong in-person component where they got some news
Right.
remotely, but the implications were that in person X, Y, and Z is now going to happen. And I think that's the sort of slightly heretical thing in the sort of context of let's bow down to the world of tech. But I think the reality is that that's a current criticism of the current crop of big tech companies or hyperscalers, if you will, which is that they intrinsically in their business models and services everything is exceptionally transactional,
Yes.
and partly there's a gap in materially relational technologies, but also the philosophy behind those businesses and those experiences is heavily transactional. And you can see that in decisions they've made and public announcements that they make. And if they're publicly quoted, you can pick through the analyst reports and the statements by the various people and press releases and books that have come out and all the rest of it. You can tell philosophically where their values lie and materially where their values lie from the experiences and products they create. And I think that's it's a double-edged sword. People, have made lots of money and got a huge amount of satisfaction and spent a amount of time in and on those sort of websites, basically. But you've also got a huge amount of negative consequences that have happened since, 2000, since 2010. So 2000 for me is always, that's when the internet went mainstream with broadband and Wi-Fi. And then basically 2010 is when Apple and Android, I think it was like 08, 09 when Apple and Android released their app stores. So
Yeah.
we call it 2010 to give it a year to adopt and whatever. And you obviously now we're sort of 15, 16 years on from those app stores. And you can see the state of, well, certainly the English speaking world and the Western world. There's lots of things that people might say, well, I don't think everyone, I mean, you're not turning the clock back and putting genies back in bottles, but there's certainly people are now acutely aware of the downsides of a lot of these things, where that wasn't as much the case however many years ago.
Well, you're providing a way to mitigate some of that stuff. And
Yeah, hopefully, yes.
so here's my last question for you. Um, this is I take it this is a new venture for you.
Hmm.
Um, so
Yeah, because I'm gonna have to run in a sec.
yeah, I know that. So how do you want people to interact with you about this? Do you want more people to become involved, or do you want to grow slowly? Tell me, tell us how you want people to talk to you about what you're doing and whether they want to be involved with what you're doing.
So the you can find the website at lovetrustandwealth.network, and sort of everything's on there. And then, yeah, if people want to join, reach out to me, talk to me, go to the website, get in touch. All of those things are there, and we're definitely looking for people that want to, join and experience this menu and experience these tables for sure.
Okay, well, so as we close here, just send me whatever you want to put in the show notes and a picture, and
Okay,
when we release this out in a couple of weeks, maybe we'll find some people who want to be a part of what you're doing, which would be great. And I thank you,
fantastic.
Bruce. Thank you very much for
Thank you, Ed.
being with us, and thank you all for watching. And we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.